Think you're clever with your smart locks, motion sensors, and camera doorbells? Try surviving a medieval raid with nothing but a bucket of hot sand and a hedge full of thorns. In an age without electricity, ice, or police on speed dial, ordinary people came up with genius ways to protect their homes from bandits, soldiers, and worse. And here's the kicker. Many of their forgotten tricks would still work better than your alarm app today. We're diving deep into 8 of the most clever medieval defense hacks that stood the test of time. And you'll be shocked how many are hiding in your neighborhood right now. One even inspired modern gated communities, but it wasn't built for rich people. You think your home security system is clever? Imagine facing an enemy siege with nothing but straw bale walls and a moat that freezes in winter. That was medieval villagers' reality. They had no CCTV, no guard dogs, no tasers, just cunning, desperation, and survival instinct. And some of their forgotten defense tricks? They'd make today's home security tech look amateur. Let's set the scene. It's the 13th century across Europe. Small settlements dot the countryside, isolated, unfortified, and often just a cluster of half-timbered houses. Vikings, raiders, brigands, or rival lords could strike with little warning. The result? Villagers had to improvise defenses quickly, with limited resources, relying on strategy more than stone walls. First line of defense. Engineered obstacles disguised as natural growth. Some villages planted dense, pliable hawthorn thickets around clusters of homes. The thorns were brutal, the growth fast, and it looked like wild underbrush. Raiders expecting an easy pillage would instead find themselves tearing apart clothes, slowing their advance, and alerting defenders. These barrier hedges were effective, cheap, and low maintenance. Modern landscaping? Think anti-climb plants instead of CCTV walls. But hedges weren't enough when speed was everything. So some communities dug booby-trapped pits at choke points, between homes, near wells, on tight approaches. Covered with thin boards or turf, these pits would collapse under an unsuspecting intruder, dropping them into waist-deep holes. Often the bottom was lined with sharpened stakes. Capture, not kill, because a thief hauled back to the reeve could be punished publicly and used as a deterrent. Imagine a burglary trapdoor that hides until you fall through. When water was abundant, villagers used another trick. Invisible water trenches. Instead of open moats, they dug shallow but wide trenches, then camouflaged them with reeds, tied vines overhead, or surface mulch. They only caught attackers who charged in blindly. Defenders, watching from concealed vantage points, used arrows, spears, even boiling liquids on the incautious. It was like a medieval IKEA. Innovative, flat packable, and deadly. There were also sound barriers, long before acoustic sensors. Some defensive gardens kept a gravel perimeter just inside fragile screens of saplings. Step on the gravel, and the crunch echoed far louder than the intruder's footsteps. This gave villagers precious seconds to arm themselves or alert nearby watches. Think of it as a privacy fence fitted with motion-activated gravel. Another harsh but brilliant tactic. Decoy livestock and houses. If marauders spotted large animals, they came expecting food or ransom. Some communities raised a few sheep or cows, then moved them quickly when danger neared. That surprise delayed the raiders while villagers evacuated or prepared the real settlement. It was early diversionary thinking, bait to waste enemy time. One of the most cunning strategies? False doorways and hidden passages. Many medieval homes were built with spare walls or doors painted on plaster, leading to thick walls or stairwells. Attackers wasted time and exposed themselves. Inside, villager families could double back, hide valuables, or escape to cellars. Think of modern panic rooms behind closet doors, but made from timber and plaster. Perhaps the most underappreciated medieval defense was networked villages, a kind of early security grid. Small settlements often spaced a day's walking distance apart, with sight lines or signal towers between. A bell tolled or a fire lit, and everyone knew that raiders were caught somewhere in the loop. Villagers had early warning. Those without towers used signal drums or horns. The network worked like a rural alarm system, decentralized, resilient, and fast-growing. All of these defenses relied on simplicity, deception, and human instincts. They weren't flashy, they weren't expensive, but they were effective. A raider chasing loose sheep into traps, falling into camouflaged pits, and picking through thorn hedges while villagers silently armed themselves. That's medieval home security on steroids. In the next part, We'll see how these tricks evolved into community-wide defense strategies, how peasants banded together to defend entire valleys using minimal resources, and how these ideas influenced castle design across Europe. As medieval raids intensified and borders blurred with constant skirmishes, isolated defense tricks weren't enough. What began as individual home survival tactics slowly morphed into communal defense systems, a grassroots full village upgrade to safety. Forget knights in shining armor. The real defenders were cobblers with clubs, bakers with pitchforks, and grannies who knew how to booby-trap a goat path. In most parts of Europe, especially in frontier zones or lawless fiefdoms, villagers could count on one thing: the Lord wouldn't arrive in time. So they organized themselves into watch rotations. These were not formal militias, just locals armed with whatever they could wield. Clubs, axes, slingshots, even sharpened wooden poles. Watches rotated nightly with horn blasts, bells, or simply a designated caller making rounds if danger was spotted. The tools of the trade were basic, but brutally efficient. Man-traps, metal or wooden snares, were set up near key entrances. Some were even embedded in the village path, disguised with straw. The goal wasn't to kill outright, but to wound and immobilize. Once the attacker was down, the villagers would rush out and deal with him as a group. These weren't passive defenses. They were active deterrents, and they worked. One forgotten tactic involved burning barriers. If a raiding party advanced too far, villagers lit pre-soaked barriers of kindling and pitch. These were placed in narrow paths between homes or on bridges. The smoke disoriented attackers. The fire forced them to choose new, unfamiliar routes, often where traps or ambushes waited. It was medieval crowd control with smoke and fear. Even more inventive were collapse traps built into roofs or outbuildings. If attackers breached the edge of a settlement, some homes had attic spaces filled with stones or sand. A quick yank of a rope collapsed the load down onto invaders entering through the front. It sounds dramatic, but this was low-cost engineering, deadly gravity used by those without swords. And when all else failed, villagers didn't retreat. They redirected. False trails were a favorite trick. Livestock dung, broken carts, or even spare shoes were deliberately scattered along side paths, leading away from the real escape routes. Raiders, thinking they had found a fleeing family or hidden valuables, chased ghosts. Meanwhile, villagers slipped out through the real exit, often hidden through barns, latrines, or grain silos that backed into forests or cliffs. Communities even coordinated decoy noise. Drums, pots, and horn blasts weren't just a call for help. They created auditory confusion. At night, especially during fog or storms, a single drummer could make a raiding band think they were facing an entire armed garrison. Some villages built hollow wooden platforms that amplified stomping, tricking intruders into believing dozens of troops were marching. Think medieval subwoofers, turning panic into an illusion of power. In regions with heavy snow, villagers used frozen traps. Buckets of water poured onto narrow passes froze into slick, deadly slides. Spiked branches were laid beneath. It was cruel. It was effective. And in places like Alpine Switzerland or Norse settlements, it was often the only line of defense that worked in deep winter. Some even weaponized livestock. Angry geese tied near key paths acted like medieval alarm systems. Loud, aggressive, and territorial, they made stealth impossible. A panicked pig or donkey driven toward attackers created chaos. And if you've never seen a medieval manuscript drawing of a goat being used as a battering ram, yes, it happened. And yes, it was surprisingly strategic. At the heart of all these tactics was one idea: collective ingenuity over brute force. Unlike castles or fortified towns, rural villages didn't have the luxury of stone walls or paid guards, but they had people. And people, when threatened together, get smart fast. Every tool was a weapon. Every chore, stacking hay, hauling water, tending fences, became a chance to lay a trap. And the communal side of it changed medieval culture. In many areas, defense became a shared civic duty. Men trained boys to identify good ambush spots. Women passed down recipes for pitch mixtures that stuck to chainmail. Elders told stories not just of saints and legends, but of past raids. What worked? What failed? Villages that survived did so by preserving knowledge and upgrading it each generation. Some even developed mock raids, the medieval equivalent of a fire drill. Once a year, they'd simulate an invasion, testing signals, gathering weapons, and seeing how quickly they could move livestock or children to safety. This wasn't just preparation, it was community theater with life or death stakes. The goal? When the real attack came, no one hesitated. This culture of practice created ripple effects. Certain tools, like the billhook or long-handled rake, were redesigned to double as weapons. Even architecture shifted. More homes were built in clusters, tight enough to create defensive bottlenecks. Entryways narrowed. Roof lines overlapped to limit climbing. Second-story balconies became makeshift archer posts. And when these measures proved successful, word spread. Villages shared techniques through trade, marriage, or religious festivals. Some defensive tricks became so standardized, they were recorded in peasant almanacs or parish logs. One English record from 1374 describes wooden snares dug at the lane's mouth, renewed every harvest. Another from Flanders lists the 3 cries of warning: fire, beast, and blade, each with a unique bell pattern. It wasn't just defense anymore, it was identity. To defend your village wasn't just to survive, it was to prove your loyalty, your cleverness, your value to the group. And the line between defense and daily life blurred. Children played with mini-traps. Women spun wool while watching sheep near booby-trapped fences. Every movement, every routine, doubled as a layer of protection. But there were limits. No trap stopped a determined warband forever. And some villages, especially those with trade routes or coveted land, learned that traps delayed but never defeated organized armies. That's when they began to adopt elements from military outposts: towers, reinforced gates, walls of earth and stone. The era of improvised defense was giving way to hybrid settlements, part village, part fort. In the next part, we'll explore how these grassroots tactics inspired full-blown fortress design, how castles, keeps, and walled cities borrowed tricks from the peasants they were meant to protect. Because before engineers drew up blueprints, villagers had already written the playbook for surviving the worst. The castle didn't invent security, it just scaled it. By the time massive stone fortresses rose above Europe's ridgelines, the design philosophies they followed were already well tested in the fields and alleys of peasant villages. The pivot came when kings and warlords realized what villagers had always known. Survival wasn't about brute strength. It was about buying time, creating friction, and tricking the enemy long enough to tip the odds. Medieval castles didn't start as grand halls. Most began as motte and bailey structures, a wooden tower on a raised mound with a courtyard below, encircled by a palisade and a ditch. But look closer, and you'll spot the DNA of village defense. Narrow entries, twisting paths, deliberately confusing layouts. These weren't design accidents. They were tactical layers, built to disorient and delay. Take the murder hole, that delightful term for the small opening above a castle's main gate. From there, defenders dropped rocks, scalding water, or boiling sand. But this was just a high-tech version of what villagers had done for centuries with barrels of dung or rooftop sand traps. It wasn't just about hurting the enemy. It was about shaking their morale, making them hesitate, making them bleed time. The zigzag entry used in many Norman castles? That forced attackers to expose their flanks, step by awkward step. Again, villagers had already pioneered this with winding paths and funnel trails through forests. Peasant logic went like this: make them walk the longest way possible through the narrowest space possible, and make sure someone's waiting at the end with a spear. Even trapdoors and hidden staircases, used by lords to escape from besieged castles, mirrored earlier village tunnel routes and cellar exits. In fact, some castles were built directly atop former village sites, preserving the escape tunnels and underground caches of grain or weapons. It was architectural evolution, organic and brutal. As fortifications became more sophisticated, so did the use of optics and deception. Slit windows weren't just for archers. They made it nearly impossible for attackers to guess how many defenders were inside. From outside, it could look like 2 archers guarding the rampart. In reality, it might be 20 rotating through covered corridors. This illusion of strength often deterred attacks entirely. The same trick was once used by villagers: strategically placed scarecrows, dummies in armor, or even silhouettes painted on fabric and propped in high windows. Moats, too, took on a new form. While villages dug trenches or camouflaged pits, castles weaponized water. But it wasn't always about depth. It was about psychological impact. A shallow, muddy moat filled with refuse and dead animals was often more repulsive and demoralizing than a deep, clean one. Disease and disgust worked as well as spears. This wasn't defense, it was warfare by bacteria. Inside castle walls, some of the smartest defenses came not from the architects, but from stewards and servants who'd grown up in rural settlements. Kitchens doubled as panic rooms. Wine cellars hid priests and documents. Laundry chutes became smuggling tunnels. In one documented case during the 100 Years' War, a castle cook used a dumbwaiter to send messages and boiling soup to attackers climbing the kitchen wall. One of the most influential but overlooked defensive upgrades was the machicolation, an overhanging parapet with openings for dropping objects. Its origin? Wooden balconies in village homes used to dump boiling water on thieves. The concept scaled up. What was once a boiling cauldron from a thatched roof became a siege defense tool in stone citadels. Same idea, higher budget. Yet even with stone, fire remained the great equalizer. Peasants had long known how to ignite pitch, hay, and even animal fat to create firewalls. Castles learned quickly to install stone fire breaks, anti-fire corridors, and chimneys with narrow bends that could be blocked to suffocate flames. But defenders often still resorted to that old village classic, the flaming cart. Set ablaze and rolled downhill, it disrupted siege towers, burned ladders, and panicked infantry. One man's hay cart became another man's tank. What's striking is how many castle defenses were reactive adaptations of peasant improvisation. Even the layered gates of concentric castles echoed how rural communities built successive lines of defense: hedge, ditch, thorn, door. The principle remained the same: delay, divide, disorient. Meanwhile, attackers evolved too. Siege engineers studied these tricks, tried to neutralize them. Sappers dug under walls to collapse foundations. Siege towers carried roof covers soaked in vinegar to resist fire. But defenders never stopped adapting. In Eastern Europe, defenders packed hornets' nests into clay pots and dropped them on siege crews. The tactic is documented in Polish annals and later replicated in Hungarian fortresses. And in the Middle East, during the Crusades, defenders in fortresses like Crac des Chevaliers employed mirrored sunlight flashes to signal nearby castles, an upgrade from village smoke signals or bell tolls. That ancient network mentality persisted, scaled for empire. Even when castles began to fall out of favor, thanks to gunpowder and professional armies, the principles behind them stayed. Urban design began incorporating defensive logic. Walled cities copied castle layouts. Barricades and checkpoints during revolts mimicked village choke points. And ironically, as cities grew, rural defense shrank. Villages were once again left to defend themselves with brain over brawn. But here's the twist. Long after castles crumbled, the ideas lived on in homes, farms, and even gardens. Defensive architecture never truly left us. It just adapted, hidden in basements, alleyways, and landscaping. Next, we'll uncover how those same medieval defensive principles quietly slipped into the DNA of modern architecture and civilian design. Why the layout of your neighborhood, your backyard fence, or even your front door may owe more to a 14th century villager than to any 21st century architect. Because some tricks are too clever to forget. By the time the Middle Ages were winding down and early modern Europe was emerging from its feudal cocoon, the echoes of those old village defense tricks hadn't faded. They'd multiplied. In fact, they had become so embedded in daily life that people no longer recognized them as defensive at all. They were just part of how communities functioned, how homes were built, how neighborhoods were shaped. But the need for defense didn't vanish. It only shifted. Instead of fending off raiders, the threat came from bandits, revolts, political instability, and even soldiers turned rogue. The transition from rural trap rigging to urban defense planning is one of the great underappreciated shifts in history. When villages grew into towns and towns into cities, the DNA of peasant defense tactics scaled with them. Consider the medieval walled city, not the romantic postcard version, but the gritty, lived-in version. Its streets were narrow and winding, not because of poor planning, but by design. Just like the forest trails and hedge labyrinths of earlier villages, these streets were meant to confuse, split, and slow down intruders. In the event of a riot, mercenary raid, or uprising, local guards knew the turns. Outsiders didn't. Chase dynamics favored the home team. The winding, cramped streets also limited the mobility of horses and carts. Even if an enemy broke through the gate, they'd be stuck in a maze of stone. hearing shouts and horns bounce off walls, with boiling water possibly waiting above. In that sense, every alleyway in medieval Prague or York was a continuation of the booby-trapped footpaths of rural France. The homes themselves carried forward defensive logic. In many cities, front doors were deliberately offset from staircases, forcing intruders to pivot or expose themselves. Window grates weren't just for theft. They were holdovers from eras when archers might need to shoot out at street level from safety. Even the use of stone lintels and fireproof vaults in wealthier homes wasn't aesthetic. It was learned behavior from generations who'd watched their homes burn during attacks. Out in the countryside, the legacy continued in a different form. As centralized authority grew and standing armies became common, individual villages began focusing less on stopping armies and more on surviving isolation, famine, or lawlessness during war. And so, the humble farmstead fortress was born, a hybrid of home, barn, and mini bastion. These weren't castles. They were cleverly built cottages with thick lower walls, few ground-level windows, and escape hatches through the roof or cellar. Courtyards were enclosed not just for livestock, but to prevent easy access by outsiders. Fences were built not in straight lines, but in stuttered patterns that obscured direct vision and encouraged hesitation. Again, not fancy, just brutally effective. One ingenious adaptation was the Cruck frame barn, popular in parts of England. The curved timbers created a high, vaulted interior, allowing carts and livestock to be stored out of sight, even under siege. Some were built with interior partitions that could be barred shut, so if raiders broke in, they'd face layer after layer of resistance, just like with early concentric castles. In Eastern Europe, where Mongol raids and nomadic incursions were still a threat even in the 15th century, whole villages were sometimes built in valleys surrounded by earth ramparts and hidden ditches. To outsiders, they looked like simple pastures or empty lowlands. But inside those borders were dozens of homes, each with its own escape tunnel and defense plan. The entire settlement functioned like a slow-burning trap. Attackers who charged in found themselves surrounded by invisibly networked defenders, often routed before they realized the scale of what they were facing. It wasn't just architecture. The cultural habits bred by generations of grassroots defense seeped into everything. Festivals had dual purposes. Celebration, yes, but also drills. Processions familiarized locals with rally points. Bell patterns were still practiced, and certain church towers retained lookouts. In Germany, the term Wehrkirche emerged. Churches fortified with towers, battlements, and storerooms. Parishioners prayed on Sunday, then locked themselves inside on Monday if raiders came. These defense tactics became invisible institutions. People weren't even fully aware they were participating in military infrastructure. When a mother told her children not to play past the hedgerow, she was also enforcing a boundary. When a miller locked his grain store behind an iron-bound door with a bar across it, it wasn't just about theft. It was about holding out through siege. Every rung of village life reinforced a centuries-old strategy of survival through simplicity, concealment, and improvisation. Meanwhile, in cities, guilds and merchant leagues began incorporating their own security methods. Storefronts had roll-down shutters made of thick oak. Basements connected across rows of houses for smuggling or escape. Even signage played a role. Painted symbols above doorways let residents know which homes had spare weapons or water or medicine. It was a medieval version of a neighborhood watch, coded in iconography. As Europe entered the gunpowder era, many of these methods began to fade, or so people thought. But in truth, they simply shifted roles. What once was a pit trap for raiders became a foundation trench. What had been a lookout bell tower became a church steeple with clocks. Yet underneath, the instincts remained. The defensive psychology never really left. And then came the shock. In times of crisis, even centuries later, these tricks re-emerged. During the 30 Years' War, villagers in Central Europe returned to digging hidden shelters. During World War II, resistance fighters used medieval-style escape tunnels and networked bell systems to signal Nazi patrols. In remote parts of the Balkans, some homes still had booby-trapped gates as late as the 1990s. Because when modern security failed, people turned back to what had worked for 1,000 years, and it didn't stop with war. Think of any modern gated community, suburban cul-de-sac, or fenced estate. The logic is the same. Limit access, control movement, increase visibility from within, and create psychological deterrence. A driveway sensor is just a high-tech version of a goose pen. A panic room is just a castle's hidden chapel. We haven't replaced medieval defense. We've just put Wi-Fi on it. In our final part, we'll bring it all home. Literally. You'll see how forgotten medieval defense tricks not only survived, but quietly shape your everyday environment, from garden hedges and backyard layouts to front porches and even door locks. The medieval mindset never left us. It just went suburban. Step outside your house. Look at your fence, your porch light, your front door. Odds are, whether you live in the suburbs or the city, you're surrounded by medieval thinking. Not swords and catapults, but the psychology behind how people built to survive. And it's not just about the dramatic stuff like walls and locks. It's in the little things, the layout of your garden, the way your path curves, the height of your mailbox. Because deep down, we're still defending ourselves like our ancestors did, just with better materials. Let's start with a classic, the front hedge. You might think it's just landscaping, but its roots, pun intended, are medieval. Dense, thorny shrubs were planted not for beauty, but to deter both human and animal intruders. Hawthorn, blackthorn, and bramble were the medieval equivalents of barbed wire. Fast forward to today, and we've domesticated that defense. The taller your hedge, the more private, and the more intimidating to strangers. It's passive protection, just like the peasants intended. Now look at your front door. Is it flush with the sidewalk or set back? Is it framed by a porch, flanked by lights, raised by steps? All of these elements serve defensive functions. A porch is a buffer zone. Steps slow movement and add visibility. Lights create exposure, what medieval sentries called field of vision. And if your door is solid wood with a peephole or camera, that's a murder hole's great-great-grandchild, still letting you see them before they see you. Driveways and cul-de-sacs follow the same logic as medieval approach paths. Curved routes increase visibility and force vehicles, or invaders, to slow down. Dead-end streets give residents a surveillance advantage. And gated communities? They're castles with digital drawbridges, swipe cards instead of chains. But the principle's the same. Delay, control, defend. Even your backyard might be telling a medieval story. Raised garden beds? They double as barriers. Garden walls? They create blind spots for outsiders, but clear patrol zones for you. The placement of windows? Historically aligned to maximize defense and minimize exposure. That big oak tree near your fence line? Villagers planted similar trees to obscure sight lines and serve as natural watch points. You call it shade. They called it cover. And it's not just about physical structures. Behavioral patterns passed down for centuries still play out today. Neighborhood watch programs echo medieval bell systems. Motion sensors mimic gravel paths and guard geese. Security signs in your window? Modern scarecrows. They're meant to suggest a presence, even if you're not home. Just like the dummy archers painted on shields centuries ago. Let's talk about home interiors. Open concept living is trendy now, but even that has echoes in medieval hall design. Big central rooms let families watch each other, manage fires, and defend from within. Hidden storage compartments, once used for valuables during raids, are now clever cabinetry. Even the idea of a safe room isn't new. In many peasant homes, the root cellar wasn't just for food. It was an emergency shelter. Thick-walled, underground, and accessible only from within. Then there's lighting. Your motion-activated porch light, your smart floodlights, your always-on hallway nightlight. These are just modern torches. Medieval defenders lit paths not just to see, but to signal others and deter attackers. Light has always been the universal tool for claiming space and saying, "I'm watching." Technology didn't erase these instincts. It enhanced them. Home cameras now monitor what arrow slits once did. Smart locks are digital portcullises. Pet dogs double as alarms. If you've ever left a lamp on while out of town, congratulations. You've used a decoy tactic older than the Black Death. And your GPS or home alarm notifying your phone? That's just a high-tech village network updated for the 21st century. What's more fascinating is how we return to these tactics instinctively. During blackouts, people light candles and guard their doors. In emergencies, neighborhoods close ranks and share supplies, just as villages once pooled grain and guarded each other's herds. Crisis resurrects the medieval within us. And this revival isn't limited to individuals. Architects, city planners, and security experts study medieval fortification principles when designing everything from airports to malls. Why? Because those principles still work. Control choke points, increase visibility, layer your defenses. Use psychology as much as physics. Take modern stadiums. They use spiral ramps and layered exits not just for traffic flow, but to control panicked crowds, the same way castle architects once managed troop movements. Airports are designed to funnel you through narrow, monitored paths, just like drawbridge approaches. Even amusement parks use color, sound, and layout to manipulate your movement and awareness. That's medieval defense turned into commercial flow control. It's also telling that survivalist culture, preppers, off-grid builders, bunker enthusiasts, rely heavily on old-world ideas. Root cellars, smokehouses, firewood stacking, perimeter fences, water cisterns. These aren't just throwbacks, they're continuity. People preparing for the worst often look backward, not forward, because those who made it through the past knew how to outlast chaos. There's a kind of poetic justice in that. The humble villager, once mocked for setting traps in the forest or layering dung walls for insulation, has become the model for modern resilience. He didn't have tech, he didn't have wealth, but he had knowledge, instinct, and community. And those three things still beat gadgetry when the lights go out. So next time you lock your door, turn on the porch light, or check your security cam app, spare a thought for the medieval minds who figured out the hard way how to protect a home. You're not just living in a modern house. You're living inside 1,000 years of trial and error, fear and ingenuity, failure and survival. And the best part? Most of their tricks still work today. Not because we're stuck in the past, but because some ideas are just too clever to forget. For all our technological progress, one truth remains. We're still trying to keep the bad guys out and our families safe inside. The difference is, we've traded boiling pitch for security lighting and thorn hedges for privacy fences. But the logic, the strategy, and the instinct? Straight out of the medieval playbook. So, here's a question for you. Which of these ancient defenses do you still see around your own home? Do you think our modern systems are smarter, or just more expensive versions of the same old tricks? Drop your thoughts in the comments. We want to hear what you'd add to your own medieval-style home defense setup. And if you love discovering how past wisdom still shapes your world, hit subscribe and tap the bell so you never miss a wild slice of medieval reality.